I want to touch on really quick before we get into adjusting exposure and stuff is the fact that you can also paint with these tools. Not only can you just do spots like we've been doing, and notice that whenever I click on this tool, all of the spots reappear so that I can see where I previously made changes. I can actually paint with this tool now as well. So notice that if I click and hold and then paint, it goes and samples and brings in a texture in that area that I painted instead of just a round circle only. You notice also that there's an opacity slider that I can use to adjust because if for some reason that change doesn't look natural, like I can see the edges of that brush change right here and the texture change in the skin. I can actually, I'll select this one, make sure it's selected, and bring the opacity down and help out more with that blending. And that tends to kind of help if it doesn't look natural, you can blend it a little bit more and help that process along. This paint option works not only with clone but with the Heal tool, which are Photoshop type features that are now available in Lightroom. So before we'd have to do this type of thing in Photoshop, which is a time-consuming process. Okay, so now that we have all of our cleanup done, I typically like to turn on our clipping notifications here. Red means that these are spots that are blown out, too much light in that area, which means we're losing detail. And then blue is actually complete black, and we're losing detail there as well. So the first thing that I typically do is turn those on, and you can do that by just clicking on these boxes up here for highlights and for shadows, and then I would drag my highlight slider down until they disappeared. And notice it doesn't take much for me to get rid of those notifications altogether. Now, the only blue that I'm getting, the only notifications that I'm getting are inside of his nostril, which is not that big of a deal. So with my adjustments, I might increase my shadows a little bit just to kind of bring that away. But notice that by increasing my shadows, I'm blowing out the teeth. And so there's a happy medium here between making these adjustments. As I increase my shadows, I'd also have to decrease my highlights, which then is going to add more darkness back into some of the shadow areas. So there's kind of a happy medium that you have to come up with here. And so let's go back out to the full image. I typically, if there's an area that would be completely dark anyways, like inside the nostril or deep inside the mouth or whatnot, I would just leave that alone. I don't really care that much as long as it's not a whole lot of clipping. Clipping being the term for maxed out, basically. So I'm not, that's not a big deal for me having a little bit of clipping inside the nostrils. That's just not a big deal. But when you go to print a photo, you don't want solid black being laid down. When it prints that image out, if there's solid white being laid down in the lines on his shirt, then that's lost to detail that's not going to look too well in a photo. So I want to make sure to bring back some of that detail as best as I can. And then, of course, you can turn these back off by just clicking and getting rid of those notifications. Usually I just leave them turned on so that way they're still on when it comes time for me to edit the next image. All right, so if I want to crop this image, I simply click on this button here, and then I can just crop and bring that in a little bit and kind of reposition this a little bit. Now, as far as exposure, I feel that everything is fine. I like a little bit of darkness on this side of his head as opposed to more lightness on here. It adds definition and perspective to the image. One thing that I typically like to do is increase my clarity a little bit, and I do this more on males than I do on females. I like to increase the clarity a little bit on females just to kind of increase the sharpness and kind of make the photo a little more dramatic. But on men, I do it more because we're okay with seeing more harsher edges and stuff on the male face and body. But on the female face and body, we want softness and we don't want it to be so harsh. So I typically don't increase too much on the clarity on a female image. Notice that increasing that clarity clipped things a little bit. So I may need to increase my shadows a little bit. I definitely don't want clipping inside the eye like that. I don't want solid black in the eye. I want some form of detail in the eye. So I may, mess around with my sliders a little bit, just increasing the blacks level there a little bit. Brought that back. Notice I have a little bit of clipping on the teeth. So I could either lower my highlights again a little bit, or I could bring that shadows back down a little bit and then decrease the highlights a little bit until I get that detail back in the teeth. So let's look at kind of before and after from my last spot removal. So let's go all the way back here, and that included our crop. Let's just click from before the crop. You can see a little bit of a difference here in the overall image. We're bringing in detail in the shirt, the face. I mean, everything is just coming together a little bit. One other thing that I like to do is take advantage of profile correction in Lightroom. Typically, Lightroom will automatically detect your camera and your lens and apply the appropriate profile. Sometimes when a new camera or a new lens comes out, it takes Adobe a little bit of time to get those settings into Lightroom. So you may have to use the next closest lens to what you have, or just go and manually adjust those settings. So let's go back up here. So color temperature is one thing that I typically like to adjust in my photo. Even though I do my best to set white balance in the camera before I take the photo, sometimes you have to go and adjust that manually just to kind of get the right color that you're looking for. The easiest way to do that is to use this color picker tool here and actually sample from an area that you feel best shows the white of the photo. And typically we could do that in his shirt if I felt that this was a perfect white, or if there was some other part of the background or him and I wanted to select that area and choose that as my white balance, I can do that. So for example, let's just try his shirt. I'm going to go ahead and click here, and I'm going to grab a nice white area right here and click. And it made a minor change in my image. Let's kind of go back and forth between this. You could see it just very, very basically adjusted my temperature and my tint. It looks like all it really did was adjust my tint. It just subtracted from that just a little bit, left my color temperature alone. Sometimes when you're shooting outdoors and whatnot, your color temperature changes based on where you move your camera, and so making an adjustment like this might be a lot more drastic. Because I was in an indoor controlled environment and my white balance was set pretty close to normal from the get-go, not much of an adjustment. But if I white balanced from something else, for example, you can see the preview that I'm getting in the top left-hand corner of the screen here. As I move over things, it's showing me an example of what that image is going to look like as I move around and try and white balance from other areas. This also is a neat way to get kind of a special effect on your photo. For example, if I go and I try and white balance from the background, which has kind of a gray to it, it's going to make my image appear very cool. Let me click on it and you can see what it's done here. It cooled down my image big time. It changed my temperature drastically. So let's click tint to go back to where I was, or I could just, of course, Control Z to go back and get rid of that altogether. So we also have a contrast slider here as well. If I'm feeling that this image is lacking a little bit of depth and clarity didn't bring it back, I might throw a little bit of contrast in there. And to me, what contrast does is it kind of separates the difference between your highlights and your darks a little bit, and squeezes that distance together. Before you might have a lot of color range in between with your whites and your darks. And with contrast, I feel it kind of brings that together and makes the colors a little bit harsher. Of course, you can go the opposite direction and take away from that as well, which kind of tends to soften your image and take color out of your image. So typically I will go and just increase the contrast a little bit. Sometimes I'll do that more on guys than I will on girls. Now you'll notice that as I added clarity before and a little bit of contrast, it has kind of made his skin appear a little bit more yellow than it, or even warmer than it typically would be. So sometimes I'll come and decrease my saturation a little bit, maybe -7 to -10, and it will kind of take away from that a little bit without taking away from the photo. Vibrance is another slider that can typically add too much color into something. You can also pull back vibrance. Just to give you an example, vibrance going all the way to the left takes out a lot of color, whereas going all the way to the right really brings in too much color. So using that slider is also a way to get a nice kind of additional effect to your image. I don't typically mess with the tone curve manually anymore, but you can do that. You can go in and make adjustments here. I typically use these sliders up here, which in a roundabout way is similar to going in and adjusting your tone curve. Unless I'm doing something special, I typically don't come in here and adjust my hue, saturation, or luminance based on specific colors. Now, if I had an image and I liked everything about it, but it tended to have maybe the reds were way too harsh or something like that, I can use this section to kind of back down or focus more on a specific color. So that's a nice feature to have. It's just something that I don't use too often. Split toning is also something I don't use that often anymore, but it is a neat feature in the sense that you can come in here and you can balance out your image by making changes to the saturation based on colors and your highlights. And you can also set that area based on a color as well. It comes set default to gray. So I can come in here and I could split tone these adjustments and change the hue of them and go in and make adjustments just to kind of add something into your image. And if you need that, it's a neat feature to have. Like if I'm having a hard time cooling an image down because I had my white balance just set totally wrong, and just adjusting my temperature and my tint slider isn't quite cutting it, I can come down here and spend a little bit more time in split toning and sometimes bring back some natural color into the image that I may have lost just out of a mistake with my camera. Detail is another area that I do spend a bit of time. I tend to add a little bit of noise reduction, not because an image ends up being noisy, but because the way that noise reduction works, the luminance noise reduction, is it actually smooths pixels. Notice here, let's zoom in so we have some detail on his skin. I'm going to go just 1:1, so that way we're seeing full resolution. And I'm going to bring this noise reduction slider all the way over. You're going to see what it did is it smoothed out his skin a lot to the point where it doesn't look good, but it smoothed it out. In a sense, it's like adding a blur to your image. And it also helped my background a little bit. So that's obviously too much. It comes set at 0 where you can see every little detail and imperfection, and over here we have a little bit of noise in the background, but I can bring that slider over to maybe 20, and it's going to go ahead and clean up a little bit of that noise in the background and also add just a little bit of smoothing to the skin. And so it's bringing out noise out of the image because this is a digital file. So when it takes the picture, there's a little bit of noise in there. Doesn't matter where your ISO settings are at. It's usually more apparent in lower light photos that you've taken in lower light situations, or situations like this photo where there's a background and lights, and there's dark in the background and an exposed subject in the foreground. So sometimes adding a little bit of noise reduction to that actually helps. Everything down below, post-crop vignetting and camera calibration, I don't really change any of those things. I feel that all the other settings that I've touched typically do a pretty good job. So now we've messed with the exposure and kind of the detail of our image a little bit. Let's go all the way back to our crop. Let's go back to our original, just our crop, and see the difference. You can see because of the enabling the lens profile, making changes to the lighting and the color temperature and everything of the image, we have kind of a drastic change, and it really makes this image look good. Let's go in at 1:1. Let's go in and just look at his face here. And let's go back to that crop. And so this is before the lens profile. This is everything from the crop forward after I cropped the image down a little bit. So we've got the crop here, and then we go all the way up to what we have. And you can see it's just really made his features and everything stand out a lot more. The color is more dramatic. It just feels good. It's a nice looking image. So that's typically what I do to an image. Now, I have more images here. I have 4 more images. In the next video, I'm going to show you some different options to saving what we've done as a preset, and then also applying the changes that we made to this image to other images so that we can get through these images quickly and get to the export process.